If you recall, this past summer, I spent a few weeks, a couple of months actually, going through a vision for Bethel in the future, sort of emerging out of COVID and all that had been a part of Bethel's past. We said, where do we go from here? And so I did a lengthy series, and then this past fall, we voted on it as a congregation to affirm that this is what we want to do and to be as a church. And here's a little bit of how it's stated. We said, in a world filled with confusion, division, and suffering, we want to be a sanctuary, a community of refuge and healing. And then we say we're committed to doing this, to being this, through a series of things, okay? And that's why the lengthy series, we went through all those points. And one of those points, if you recall, was being missional, living with a missional mindset. And a missional, before I read what's up there, missional simply means that we're not simply focused on us, on what we like, what makes us happy, but that we see our calling as a church to spread the gospel, to help other people, to bless other people, to bring to extend the kingdom of God around us, okay? So we live with a missional mindset, and here's how we put it: recognizing that our society is changing, and we focus on it, we choose to focus on our society as a mission field rather than a battleground. All right, so I was in Florida this past week. Charlene and I, we did a family vacation, and as I do, even while we're traveling around, I'm listening to stuff. I'm accessing, other sermons and listening to this. And I heard this sermon by this guy, and I won't mention his name. You probably wouldn't know him anyway, but he has this sermon, and the whole thing is that 2024 is going to be the year of war. This is going to be a battle year, and it's the year where there's a war against the Bible, there's a war against our values, there's a war against our church, there's a war against our faith, and so we need to be fighters in this war that we're in our world. And I find that language unhelpful. Are we really in a war? Now, we are in the midst of a spiritual battle. The forces of evil against God's work. The problem is, if I think of my life, and we as a church think of our role as fighters in a battle, what does that make our neighbor? It makes them the enemy. And to be successful in a battle, what do? We destroy our enemies. And so, again, without in any way suggesting that we compromise our truth, without in any way suggesting that we are not engaged in the public sphere, having said that, we as a church, we've talked about this. We talked about this in our leadership team, that we think it's more helpful for us to remember that we're in a mission field, and that our neighbors are lost people that we are called to love. Now, and one of the reasons this is so important to us is because that's what Jesus did. That is how Jesus lived his life. He was a friend of sinners and tax collectors. And his disciples followed that approach. They learned from that. And that's how they lived their lives, including this guy that we're talking about today, the Apostle Paul. So let's listen to how the Apostle Paul arranges his life. And to do that, here's how we're going to go through this message. And I think there's an outline in your notes or in your bulletin. And by the way, this is helpful whenever we're looking at a Bible passage. Think about these three things. What is the context? And then what is it saying? And then how do we interpret that for us today? Now, the context, super important, right? Because imagine you're in a restaurant and you overhear people in the booth behind you, and the person says, "And I am going to kill that person." But what you don't realize is what he's actually saying is, I watched this movie, and there was a crazy line in the movie where the lead character said, "I'm going to kill that person." Right? So it's all about, you're going to totally misunderstand what was being said if you don't understand the context. So that's what we're going to do first off, to understand what Paul is saying here in the context of the big picture, and then we'll look at what he says, and then we'll reflect on what does that mean for Bethel, what does that mean for me and for you today. So first, this is part of a section, chapters 8, 9, and 10, all are dealing with this topic of a controversy in this church about whether it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols. And as I've said before, Paul dictates these letters. He's got a lot to say, and as he's dictating, he sometimes goes from topic to topic like we do when we talk. And so as he's talking about food sacrificed to idols, then he's talking about some other things in the context of that. So prior to this, he says, this is in chapter 8, and we mentioned this a couple weeks ago when I was preaching on this, that he says with food sacrificed to idols, doesn't matter. Idols don't exist anyway. They're not real. So you can eat whatever you want. But Paul says, I choose not to eat food sacrificed to idols if it's going to cause other people to sin. So I abstain from this out of my consideration for other people. And then he goes on to talk about, this is how I live my life. I have things that I have the right to, but I voluntarily give up those rights if it's going to help other people. And then he's talking in the first, if you have your Bible, you can see it, the first part of this chapter, he starts talking then about money. And with the food sacrificed to idols, part of the deal is people would bring their food to the temple of whatever, let's say the goddess Aphrodite or whatever was going on there. They bring this food to the temple, and the person at the temple, the priest or priestess, they would eat some of that food. That's how they lived. And then what food they didn't need, they would sell that food in the markets. And that's, again, how the people in those early idolatry places, I can't think of the word, but those temples, that's how they lived. Also, that's how the Jewish temple worked too, right? When the Jews would bring their come for worship, they would bring food sacrifices, and the priest would eat some of that. Anyway, so while that's on his mind, now this other topic comes up about, those priests, they don't get paid, or they live off of what people give them. And Paul is like, I don't do that. I give up my right to live off of the income or off of the gifts that people give me. And so then that raises another question: is that okay? Is this what everyone should do? Because then he makes this other statement that it's a general principle that this is how things should be generally, that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Now, I'm going to, just to be clear here, this is a little weird because I'm a pastor who's paid, so it might seem self-serving for me to say this, but if just so that we're clear, in your Bible, look at verses 13 to 14 of chapter 9 here. Don't you know that those who work in the temple, this is verse 13, get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered at the altar? Again, that's what they were doing. And then he says, verse 14, in the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So like this is what people do. And here's the weird thing. Paul talks about this a fair bit because he's being criticized for it. So it might seem strange to us. We might think, wow, it's a great thing. He's not even asking for their money. He works for his own living. He works with his hands. You'd think the church would love that. They didn't. They criticized him for it. In part because the way he made his living was by tent making, and there were some people who thought that doing that was sort of that was like menial labor, that I don't know, an upstanding person shouldn't have to do menial labor. And now here's Paul wanting to be their spiritual leader, and he's doing menial labor, right? So again, part of the reason that you'll see in the book of Corinthians, Paul talking about this, how he works and doesn't have people pay him. The reason he talks about that so much is because that's one of the reasons that the people in that church look down on him. And there are people in the church who are, they're kind of in conflict a little bit, because there are some people that basically are saying, don't listen to Paul. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not necessarily someone we should be following, because after all, he's, this tent maker dude. So again, Paul is having to explain why he does this, and part of the reason he does it is he wants to have freedom, because he's going from place to place, and he plants churches, and it's easier to do that when you are, kind of independent, and he doesn't want to have there to be any constraints on what he's doing to preach the gospel. So he takes care of his own needs. All right. So in that context now, what Paul goes on to say is, number one, he just feels a deep need to preach the gospel. And he feels called to do this. And he's willing to do it even if it's not what he does for his livelihood. So he's willing to do it. He's committed to do it, even if he's not making a living at it. I think I've beat that dead horse. You get that. All right, let's keep going. All right, second thing, even though he's free, this is the big point that is kind of the theme of these chapters, right? Even though I'm free, I voluntarily relinquish that freedom if it's going to help other people. So again, verse 18. Well, pick it up at verse 17. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I simply am discharging the trust committed to me. Okay, well, what then is my reward? Verse 18. Just this, that in the preaching of the gospel, I might offer it free of charge, so not to make use of my rights in preaching it. So he's giving up the right to be paid for it. Verse 19, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many people as possible. All of this is what I do. I relinquish my rights, my freedoms, so that the gospel can go out. All right. And then he goes even further, and these verses that are maybe familiar to some of you may have seen these before, where he talks about how he's going to adapt himself in a variety of ways to different people so that he can reach them, so that he can have an audience, so that he can win them to Christ. Verse 20, to the Jews I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though I am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I myself am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so I can win those. To the weak I become weak to win the weak. I become all things to all men so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel that I might share in its blessings. All right. I'm going to adapt myself to different people in different contexts if that's going to help me reach out. Okay, so what does this mean for us? What does this mean for Bethel? And I'm going to acknowledge something first of all. First off, this is easy to misunderstand. And I think people sometimes do misunderstand what Paul is saying here. It sounds like he's saying, I'm going to do whatever I do. I'm going to live however people live so that I can reach out to them. I'm going to try to be all things to all people. And part of us thinks that's probably not a good idea, right? I mean, you can't, in fact, we even have a saying, you can't be all things to all people. Because if you do, you're not being true to yourself, right? You're not being honest, and no matter what you do, some people are going to be offended anyway. So it seems almost like, I guess our big term today is we focus on the need to be authentic, whatever that means, but to be authentic, and it seems like you're not being authentic if you are adapting yourself in different ways. So along with that, we could see how also you could have a problem where you compromise, compromise your morals. If you're going to live according to the way these people live, you'll adapt their moral life, and if you live according to how these people live, you might change your moral life. That's not what Paul's saying. That's not what Paul's saying. So this is the second principle. To understand and apply this, we've got to understand what Paul is saying here in light of who's Paul. I mean, if for Paul to say this, that must mean something a little different than you might necessarily think, because you might think that someone with this mindset we're talking about here, I'm going to adapt whatever I can to just reach out to different people. You might think that person might not have a lot of standards, right? They might compromise their standards. Boy, was the Apostle Paul somebody who would not compromise his standards. Isn't that true? I mean, he was very clear about what would be appropriate and what the gospel entails, and was not shy about challenging people if they veered from that. Think of the book of Galatians. This is where there was a controversy in the church, and there were some people who were adapting or viewing the gospel in a different way, sort of you had to become a Jew if you were going to be a Christian. And Paul was just goes on and on in that book to say, no, you can't live that way. That's not right. So he's like, here, no compromise at all. But in this other context, as he's talking about how he's adapting himself in different ways. So, do you see that it's not simple and obvious here? There's some nuances that we have to be clear about. So, this is the $100,000 question for the church today, for Bethel Church today. What should we adapt, and what should we never change? Now, I want to just let you know, I'm going to ask a couple of these questions. I'm not giving you the answer today. I think we need to wrestle with these. But what must we adapt? What must we never adapt? I'll give you an example. So here we are at Bethel Church, and you guys are letting me play a guitar. And we got John playing drums. I mean, there are some church, in fact, I remember when I was a kid discussions about this even in the Christian Reformed Church. You would not have those worldly instruments. It was only the organ that you could use if you're going to worship God, right? If you have that rock music in your worship service, you're just doing that. You're compromising. You're being worldly. In fact, Charlene and I, the first church that I was pastor of, we lived in Austin, Texas. And in Austin, Texas, there's a large group, a large denomination there that they do not have any instruments at all. That's a big deal to them. That worship is, you can't use instruments. Anyway, I don't know. I don't agree with it, but that was their view. And that using instruments in your worship is like compromising. So we have decided as a church that that's something that we will adapt. We will adapt to the culture so that we can more effectively speak to the culture, but also even ourselves. We're going to adapt, have worship be in a language and in a style that actually connects with who we are, rather than have it be a very different thing. Anyway, that's one example of something that some of us in the church, or some Christians, I should say, are clear in adapting, and certain things that they will say we will never change, we will never adapt. And I just want to say this is an ongoing, difficult job, requires thoughtfulness, requires wisdom, requires prayer, discernment. Frankly, it also requires conflict, right? We disagree about these questions, and we have to listen to each other and work with each other and reflect. This is hard work, and it is ongoing, and we have things we're struggling with as a church about what do we adapt to the world around us and what do we not. And 20 years from now, it's probably going to be other things that we'll be wrestling with, whether we're going to adapt to this or not. That struggle is always going to be there. But there's something even more pressing for us. A $100,000 question for each one of us. Not for the church, but in my own life, in your own life. And I'd like you to think about this question and wrestle with this question. And I hope all of us wrestle with this question. What am I willing to change? How am I willing to adapt my life so that I can reach people with the gospel? One way that we as Christians can live our lives is to simply say, I'm going to create in my life a bubble. I'm only going to hang out with Christians. I'm only going to participate in relationships with other Christians, and anyone outside of our group, I will just ignore and keep out of my life. That's one way to live. That's not how the Apostle Paul lived. Paul's like, I'm going to do whatever I can to reach people. And then when I do that, then I'm constantly going to be wrestling with, okay, how do I connect with this person in a way that's authentically connecting with them, but then not compromising my own beliefs? And my concern is that in my own life, and probably in most of our lives here in this church, it's easier for us to just let everybody else do their own thing and just kind of be with our group. And I have to ask that question: what am I willing? Am I willing to be uncomfortable, to hang out with people, to connect with people, to relate to people who think differently than I do, who believe differently than I do, in order for me to reach them? And again, I'm not coming here with an answer to these questions, but it's worth reflecting on.